Our two speakers today are Lynne Isbell, Professor of Anthropology at UC Davis, and Dacher Keltner, Professor of Psychology here at UC Berkeley. Dr. Isbell received her BA from Johnson College of the University of Redlands, her PhD from UC Davis in animal behavior. She taught at Rutgers and then returned in 1996 to UC Davis, where she is Professor of Anthropology. Her focus traditionally has been on primate behavior and ecology. She's done field work with red colobus monkeys in Uganda, vervets in Kenya, and lemurs and another animal, the name of which I cannot pronounce, in Madagascar. The animal is Siphakas. Shifakas? Okay, thank you. I hope that clarifies it for all the rest of you. From 1992 to 2002, she ran a field project in Kenya that focused on understanding, more involved understanding of the origin of primates, and about a year ago published a new hypothesis on primates' heavy reliance on vision, the one characteristic that distinguishes them from other mammals. The work received media coverage, partly because Snakes on a Plane was just coming out. She's written a book that goes into more detail about this. In the last chapter, she talks about what it all means for human evolution, and perhaps that's the most relevant area of her topic for us today. Professor Keltner did his undergraduate work at UC Santa Barbara, his graduate work at Stanford University. He is here at UC Berkeley, a professor of psychology, and he directs the Greater Good Science Center. His research has been in power, morality, the pro-social nervous system. He has 2 books published and one which currently doesn't have a title yet, but perhaps you can help him with that today, which is coming out from Norton Publishers in the near future. Now, if you join me in please welcoming our first speaker, Dr. Lynne Isbell. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for that nice introduction. Where are you? Well, I have to say that it's wonderful to see so many people here on a Sunday afternoon, beautiful day, late in the afternoon. You're hanging in there. This is the last question of the Wonderfest for this year, and I really appreciate your tenacity for being here today. So what the question is today is, are we wired to be kind? Now, my background is, as Steve said, in primate behavioral ecology, and I come to it from an evolutionary perspective, and that's what I'd like to bring to this talk today, is that evolutionary perspective, and then that will hopefully build onto what Dacher is going to talk about when he talks. So let's start off by talking about the opposite. We all know about meanness. We all know that animals can be mean to each other, including, I wonder is it possible to dim the lights at all? Or can you all see well enough? Okay, never mind. And here's an example of meanness in a non-human primate. This is a chimpanzee. These are 2 chimpanzees in Kibale National Park in Uganda, where I had done my research on red colobus monkeys. And this fellow here is pummeling this guy here, who died about 45 minutes after the photo was taken. So we all know that meanness happens. And anyone who knows anything about natural selection wouldn't be surprised by this. We wouldn't be surprised to hear that someone might say that we're wired for competition. We're wired for meanness. Because natural selection generally involves competition for scarce resources such as food and mates. And the more successful individuals, in other words, those who have more surviving offspring, that's the definition of success in terms of natural selection, these individuals tend to be better competitors. And competition often involves aggressive behavior. Not always. There are other kinds of competition that don't appear to be aggressive. But aggressive behavior is what I'm calling meanness. Okay. So it's pretty clear that meanness is part and parcel of natural selection. But what about kindness? Is there any selective advantage to being kind? Well, the fact that kindness is commonly seen in animals suggests that there is. And let's go through that idea. Okay, so kindness in non-human animals is mostly expressed between relatives. Here are two species of monkeys that I've studied most recently. These are vervet monkeys and these are potus monkeys. And they both live in the same place in Kenya. And they're both grooming relatives. And what happens when you groom your relative, or groom anyone, is if anyone has gone to the hairdresser, they'll know what I'm talking about. Your cortisol levels drop and you're suddenly a lot more relaxed. And that's a good thing for our immune systems. Altruism is perhaps the ultimate kindness. Altruism here, let me give you an example of altruism. This is work done by Don Owings, Richard Koss, and colleagues at UC Davis. They've studied populations, numerous populations of ground squirrels, some of which co-occur with rattlesnakes. And the populations that co-occur with rattlesnakes have, over evolutionary time, evolved a physiological resistance to venoms. And where the populations of rattlesnakes and ground squirrels don't occur together, the venom resistance drops out over about 35,000 years or so. And so adult ground squirrels have a physiological resistance to rattlesnake venoms. The pups don't. The pups' immune systems are a little bit immature, and it takes a while for them to develop this physiological resistance. And what you see is that when adult ground squirrels approach or come across a rattlesnake, if they have pups, they spend much longer mobbing these snakes than if they didn't have pups at all. And it's not that there isn't a cost to them. They don't die from the venom. But if they are bitten, if these adults are bitten, then it can be debilitating, and it can mean that they can't care for their pups. And their pups can die as a result of that. So there's a potential cost to these adults for acting in that way. And when you define altruism in a biological sense, what you're talking about is a social act that is costly to the one who's doing the behavior, to the actor. And it has to be also beneficial to the recipient. So biologically, we define altruism as a social act that decreases the fitness, or in other words, decreases the reproductive success of the actor, of the one doing the behavior, while at the same time increasing the fitness of the recipient. But the problem is that behaviors that reduce the fitness, reduce the reproductive success of individuals who act in this way, are selected against by natural selection. So how can we explain the evolution of altruism? Well, Darwin was baffled by this, but W.D. Hamilton figured out a solution to the dilemma back in the early 1960s. And this is what he argued. Okay, so here are two individuals, A and B, and when they reproduce, they give 23 pairs of their chromosomes to each of their offspring. Taking female A as an example here, these two are her offspring, a son and a daughter. And what you get here when A reproduces and has C and D is she shares half of her genome with those offspring. So she contributed half of her genome to each of her offspring. So she's related to each of them by 1/2. So what Hamilton came up with was this coefficient of relatedness, R. And what it is it's the degree of relatedness between two individuals. And so A's in the language of altruism, A's R is 1/2. She's related to each of her children by 1/2. Her coefficient of relatedness is 1/2. Okay. There are other kinds of coefficients of relatedness. Full sibs here are related to each other by 1/2. Grandparents are related to their grandchildren by 1/4. Uncles and aunts are related to their nieces and nephews by 1/8, and cousins also by 1/8. So you get variations or different degrees of relatedness depending on how closely related you are to each other. And so this thought, this idea that Hamilton had, led J.B.S. Haldane, who was an evolutionary biologist, to say that he would lay down his life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins. In fact, he was a little bit off, because if he did that, he would just break even. So he should have said that he would give his life for 3 brothers or at least 9 cousins. But in any case, the point is that the extent of kindness depends partly on how closely related individuals are to one another. If the coefficient of, this is supposed to come all at one, in separate chunks here, so sorry about the flood of words there. But anyway, if the coefficient of relatedness, R, is high enough, okay, the more closely related you are, the more likely altruism is to occur, is to evolve. But there are other things going on. And if the gain to fitness to the recipient, in other words, B, the benefit to the recipient, is high enough, if the benefit is high enough, and if the cost to the altruist, in C, designated as C, if the loss of fitness to the altruist is small enough, okay, and here's Hamilton's rule, if the cost to the altruist is small enough, if it's smaller than the benefit to the recipient devalued by the coefficient of relatedness, then what you would expect is an increase in the population in numbers of animals or individuals that are like-minded in the next and future generations. And that, he said, would lead to an increase in altruistic behavior. So it explains how it is that altruism could evolve with using natural selection. And he used kin selection as his mode for that. Okay, so altruism and kindness, which I'm calling a less dramatic cousin, are only seen in social animals. You can't be altruistic if no one is there. Okay, you have to be altruistic to somebody. And primates are among the most social of animals, and we are primates, and we are among the most social of primates. So let me go and take you through primates, and then we'll go on to humans a bit. Kindness in primates is expressed in a number of ways. Here I'm going to show you some of these. Grooming is one. I've already talked to you about why it's kind to provide grooming for somebody else. Food sharing is another kindness that animals, that the primates can use to show kindness. Protection of young and protection of unrelated young. Here's a male who's providing shelter of sorts to 3 juvenile baboons. And this male here is an interesting case. He accompanied this mortally wounded infant until it died. He followed it, and if we were to do that with somebody, we might say that's sympathy, or it's concern, some kind of concern for the individual that is hurt. This infant was attacked by a male, a different male. And it's interesting that this male was also what primatologists are calling friends with the infant's mother. He spent a lot of time with her. And whether he's related or not, we're actually not sure because the genetic data aren't in yet. But unrelated young is a good way to show kindness in primates. Okay, in humans, okay, we're similar to other primates in a lot of ways, in that altruism and kindness are directed more often toward relatives than toward non-relatives. But we're also different, okay, in that kindness is often directed toward non-relatives and even strangers who we've never seen before. So think of Hurricane Katrina, think of the fires down in Southern California, and how many of us here have donated to causes like that? People you don't even know you're helping. So that's something that I think is different in humans. Let me give you a personal example in humans of kindness. This is Margaret Kabageni. She lives in a village called Kanyawara near Kibale National Park in Uganda, where I used to work. And I've known Margaret since the 1980s. When I hired her, she was 14 years old when I hired her to help me with my research on red colobus monkeys. And so she's grown up now, and she's got a family of her own. She came to me through email, the miracles of email. She approached me a couple years back about a need that she saw in her village of Kanyawara. And what she saw was a real need for education at a level before primary school. So preschool for us. They call them nursery schools over there, but it'd be preschool for us. And so she asked me to help somehow. And I thought, this would be great. I'd love to help, but I don't know how to channel the money to her because I'm not there and I don't trust where it might end up. So then I ran into Dr. Gosia Arlett. She's a primatologist. She's from Poland, and she works in Kibali. And she has, over the past several years, created a series of libraries that are located in the homes of people or in the area so that people, children, adults can check out free of charge these books, read them, return them. And she has asked for books from people from the U.S., from Europe, Poland, everywhere, to give her the books so that she can take them. So she was already of this mindset of helping, of being kind, when I approached her to see if she could help us in some way. So here we have people who are not related to each other. We've got somebody from the U.S., somebody from Poland, and somebody from Uganda. We're not possibly related to each other. And we're all combining our efforts to pull this off. And what we ended up doing was building this preschool here in Kanyawara. And here are the children who are the beneficiaries of this opportunity that has never been there before. This is not unusual. Okay, this is not unusual. I'm not trying to toot my own horn here. Every one of us in this audience, I know, has done something like this somehow. Okay, helping is universal. Kindness is universal. And I think the person who's the kindest of all is Margaret. Okay, here she is teaching these little kids basic information. And when you think about it, when you think about teaching and what it does for people, it's got to be one of the greatest kindnesses that we can possibly do for others. And because particularly in schools, in places where the countries are still developing their infrastructure, education helps individuals gain a secure life. And for them, it may really mean the difference between life and death. The more education you have, the more secure your life is going to be. The more you can count on tomorrow. And we take that for granted here, but for people in Uganda and in Kenya and Tanzania where I work, it's not something that people can take for granted, and they know education is important. So Margaret's a real hero here, and she's not related to these kids. Okay, so the question I was wondering is, why are we so kind? What's going on there? What do we have that other animals don't have? Well, I'd like to suggest something, and truth is a great flirt. I like that for the Wonderfest because it's definitely flirting with me, and the sign of a great flirt is whether you can get the person you're flirting with to flirt back. So I think I'm going to be flirting back with truth now. I don't know if what I'm going to be saying is true, but I'm going to suggest some ideas, and maybe you guys can come up with some alternatives. But here's what I'm going to suggest. Okay. I think that what we have that other animals don't have is something I'm calling super kindness. Super kindness. And what super kindness is empathy, okay, the understanding and feeling of what it is that somebody else is feeling, plus the ability to act on it. And that's super kindness. Okay. The question is, can super kindness be explained evolutionarily? Can it be explained in terms of natural selection? Well, here are a couple of quotes that I want to show you to tell you how difficult it has been for people to explain super kindness in biological terms. So here's the Dalai Lama saying the following: for most of us, when we confront the sight of suffering, for example, a child crying, a man in agony, people dying of starvation, our immediate visceral reaction is sympathy or empathy. And I want to stress that he says, often we feel as if we ourselves are undergoing this suffering. That's a key point I want to get back to later on. And he says, such a reaction may seem inexplicable from a strictly rational, i.e. scientific, point of view. Okay, so he's sort of throwing up his hands, but he knows it happens, you know. And here's Elliot Sober, who's a philosopher of science, of biology in particular, and he's basically thrown up his hands, and he says, the idea of evolutionary side effect may be the key to understanding why human beings are able to experience extended compassion. It isn't that this ability evolved because it was beneficial to the individual. Rather, the idea is that the ability to feel extended compassion is a byproduct of selection for some other suite of traits. A byproduct, not directly selected by natural selection. Okay. Well, I want to challenge those views, and I'm going to start by looking at the biological evidence, the neural evidence. And in rhesus macaques, recently there has been a bit of press on mirror neurons. I don't know if anyone has heard of mirror neurons. Anyone? A few people? Okay. Well, what they are is they're neurons in the brain that fire or activate when the animal, the rhesus macaque, sees somebody else reach for food. It's a motor pattern that they respond to. And they're not doing it themselves, but they're watching somebody else do it. And so their neurons are firing. So they've been called mirror neurons. And I think that these mirror neurons might be precursors to empathy. That because rhesus macaques and all group-living animals have to sort of coordinate their activities. They have to sleep together, they have to feed together, they have to travel together. It's very important for them to be sensitive to what everybody else is doing in their group. And one way to do that is by having these mirror neurons fire. Have you ever noticed that yawning is contagious? Of course you have. We all know that. It's also contagious in primates. And this might suggest a reason why it is. We are also group-living animals, we humans, and it might help to coordinate our activities so that we're all basically doing the same sort of thing. We're all getting tired at the same time and wanting to go to sleep at the same time. Well, in humans, these mirror neurons are further developed, and they're activated when we observe the emotions of others. And this hasn't been found in rhesus macaques yet. It's only been found in humans. So here's a biological sort of basis for empathy to have evolved. Now, interestingly, these mirror neurons, or empathy neurons as they're also called, coincide with what is called the theory of mind, and that is the ability to recognize that others have thoughts that are not necessarily our own. Okay, we can have different thoughts, and that's something that seems to be the case only for humans. Okay, so what would it be like for us to not have a theory of mind, to not have empathy, and to not have the ability to act to reduce the suffering of others? What would that be like? Well, you know, we take it for granted that we've got that we do this, okay? But when we don't, it's definitely noticeable. And with people who have autism, what we find is that it's very difficult for them to have social relationships. So they're nearly asocial. They also seem to lack empathy, and they seem to lack a theory of mind. So kindness, this ability to empathize with others, and to do something about it, is such a part of who we are that it's only when it doesn't occur that we notice it. Okay? And when we notice it, it is seen as a pathology. So what I'm suggesting is that there were certain conditions that favored the evolution of super kindness, and one of those is having highly social lives. Highly social lives may have favored the evolution of empathy plus action, because extreme sociality provides more opportunities for us to express our kindness. As we do for our kin, it's already built in, but we're doing it for others who are not our kin. And the important thing, too, about extreme sociality is that what it does is it provides more opportunities for the benefits of kindness to accrue to actors as time goes on and when situations reverse and the favorable conditions are not so favorable, it's really important for them to be able to depend on the kindness of others. So one possible ecological factor that could be tied into this, that could have led to our perhaps unique ability, ability to be super kind, is possibly wide variation in food distribution in terms of storage, perhaps. Maybe this started to happen when we could amass a surplus of food to store it for later on. And if you were in the same environment and you had the vagaries of the weather to deal with, even small communities living in the same area could help each other out if they had stored food. Say one community was able to store a surplus of food, the other community ran out. Well, it would be very helpful if they could get that surplus of food from that community. And so what I'm suggesting is that this is perfectly understandable in terms of evolutionary evolutionary theory. There's no problem here. It's based on individual selection, so kindness isn't a problem. So super kindness would have been favored because the actor benefits. The actor benefits because being super kind ends up returning kindness to the actor over time. Okay, that this kindness of others is really important for the continued survival and reproductive success, particularly when resources such as food are distributed rather unevenly and are scarce for everyone, but at different times. Okay, so that you can go back and forth. It's sort of what is known as tit for tat or reciprocal altruism in the biological literature. Oh dear, something's happening here. Okay, there we go. So I want to conclude by suggesting that we are not only wired to be kind, but we are wired to be super kind. That natural selection may favor the evolution of empathy, and it can happen in any highly social animal. It doesn't necessarily have to be just in humans, okay? But it's hard to identify empathy in other animals. But empathy allows us to understand the plight of others, and it makes it personal because of these mirror neurons, or these empathy neurons. And this neural mechanism of empathy basically tricks us into feeling as if their plight were our own. Recall what the Dalai Lama said, okay? As if it were our own. As if it affects our own genes. And so what we do is we act to alleviate the suffering of others because that's what we do for ourselves. And that's, oh dear, it's going to go on again. Sorry about this. I don't know what the deal is here. Okay, so what I want to do is then thank you all for bearing with us and for the Wonderfest organizers and everybody else involved with it. And that includes you as the audience. So, and with that, I think Dacher should come on up.
Great. Thanks so much, Lynne. So I'm going to tell you a little empirical tale in my 15 minutes. Forgive me for having a slightly Alec Baldwin-type voice. I've been giving these healthcare lectures for 8 hours a day for the past few days and have lost my voice a bit. And it's really going to be the synthesis of a couple of streams of thought. The first is what Lynne very eloquently outlined for us, which is an evolutionary understanding with kin selection theory and the like, with respect to why in the world do we act generously and kindly and sacrifice self-interest in the service of others. And then the other intellectual tradition that will motivate the few studies that I'm going to present to you is the great tradition in emotion research that Charles Darwin really founded in 1872 when he wrote The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals. And what he was interested in is what are the expressive behaviors and patterns of emotional behavior that we see today? How can we trace them back in human evolution to understand where these behaviors come from? And I'm going to try to do, with feeble attempts from our laboratory and other laboratories, to really complete a story that he began. He thought that the foundation of the social contract and the moral good was in sympathy and compassion, but failed to really think about it from his emotion perspective. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today, is really the human equivalent of the kind of altruistic behavior that you saw in the food sharing, protection of young, in the primates that Lynne studies, and it's the emotion of compassion. Now, very interestingly, for those of you like Steve who are interested in philosophy, compassion has not fared well in the annals of Western thought. In fact, I was just reading Immanuel Kant's wonderful book on the beauty and the sublime, and out came a rather random comment on this emotion that he called weak and blind, which was sympathy. And that's fairly characteristic of Western thought. We tend to think, and I think erroneously, empirical science will show, that compassion belittles people who are the targets of compassion, that it entails a loss of that cherished commodity freedom. Certainly Kant was worried that compassion is inherently subjective and therefore unreliable as a guide to how we decide what's right and wrong. Of course, almost everything is subjective, so that falls on into problems. And then compassion, it is commonly thought as an enemy to achievement, that somehow if we act on compassion, or a society is guided by compassion, the farther reaches of human achievement are not reached. This flows out of what a lot of people are starting to critique the social, biological sciences for, and in fact, people like Elliot Sober and others are starting to raise questions about the philosophical foundations of our science, that it presupposes selfishness, everything's self-interested, competition, we're wired to compete. What about the alternative? And finally, hedonism, that we're wired only to pursue what gratifies our own reward circuitry or our own sense of pleasure. You don't have to go very far in your readings to find these kind of assumptions. Sigmund Freud, we are descended from a long chain of murderers, which led to the commandment, thou shalt not kill. Ayn Rand, one of the great enemies of compassion, if you will. If any civilization is to survive, it's the morality of altruism that men have to reject. Machiavelli, of course, was interested in this, and others, that there's a general skepticism toward the possibility, as Lynne was starting to build a case for, that sacrifice and compassion can be built into our nervous systems for principled reasons. Interestingly, there are alternatives. You see different conceptions of human nature in East Asian thought, as in His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Non-randomly appeared in Lynne's quotes as well. Cooperation, not conflicts, lies at the heart of the basic principles that govern human existence. I like his quote, if you want to be happy, practice compassion. If you want others to be happy, practice compassion. And then Charles Darwin had several quotes about making a case for the evolution of sympathy and compassion. His very simple reasoning, it'd be interesting to get Lynne's thoughts about this, was that for our offspring to make it to the next generation, we need compassion. And had several quotes on that notion. So in my remaining 11 minutes or so, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you the human evolutionary story of compassion, talk about some proximal mechanisms, and even tell you a study published by Richie Davidson, a neuroscientist, showing that with a little bit of mindfulness, we can actually cultivate compassion. So, just some definitions. Compassion in the human literature is the concern to enhance the welfare of another who is in need. This dates back to Aristotle and very systematic treatments of compassion. Empathy, those mirror neurons that Lynne was talking about, in humans we separate that from compassion. Empathy is this miracle of how we mirror other people in terms of emotions, facial behavior, and the like. We're wired to imitate. My favorite demonstration of this, it's partially off topic, forgive me. There are studies of imitation showing people going into museums end up imitating sculptures that are nearby. If a sculpture is doing this, the person observed in the study will say, I feel like some lunch, right? The sculpture is doing that. The human being will say, let's go get some lunch. We are wired to imitate thanks to those amazing mirror neurons that Lynne detailed for us. And then pity, it has status built into it, as I connote in the definition. And a lot of people have been interested in a variation of a pro-social state called a love of humanity, which is really about sort of a default affection toward human beings. So here's a nice picture from a hunter-gatherer culture in sub-Saharan Africa. Just amazing multi-generational face-to-face contact, spending every waking moment together. Couple of observations. So one of the questions that Lynne raised is, what about human evolution, right? The 7 million years that we broke off from the primates that she showed you photos of, the chimps and then the close relatives, the bonobos. What can we say about the forces of human evolution that may have really gave rise to this super kindness that she was talking about? Couple of biggies here. Point number one, we are a caretaking species. And I believe it is the hallmark characteristic of our social evolution that gave rise to compassion. It's very simple. Our offspring are born more vulnerable, as far as I know, than any mammal on the face of the earth. They require our offspring anywhere from 7 or 8 years to 40 or 50 years to reach the age of independence. And I kid you not, but 7, 8 years is the estimate in the ecological literature. I don't know. I look at my 8-year-old daughter. She's not ready for a job or taking care of her own kids. So, but we laugh. But our offspring, because they're born with these giant heads, with these mirror neurons, and because women, as they started to walk upright, their pelvis is narrowed, they pop out early, and they require all this massive caretaking behavior. And as Lynne's colleague, Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, nicely wrote in Mother Nature, that caretaking demand, the very heart of getting our genes to the next generation, basically reconfigured human social groups. Suddenly, caretaking was the central issue in negotiating trades with other people and the like. So I'll just state there. By the way, it's also interesting, as far as I've heard, we're the only primate species who have individuals living on into old age pretty reliably into the 60s. And that, again, introduces a requirement for care for vulnerable beings. And this built in what I'm going to talk about, our urge to care. It also built in evolutionary pressure on offspring being wired up to evoke care in others. They have these big foreheads and big eyes and little tiny mouths that pucker, and a smell of their skin and the softness that just evokes a new kind of language from people. Goo, 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 goo. You know, caretaking behavior, so we're wired up to care. Now, this is just an elaboration on what Lynne was talking about. How in the world, if in light of Lynne's analysis, caretaking, compassion, sacrifice can be so costly, right? You do not want to be caretaking all the time. You'll be readily exploited. But evolutionists like to ask the question, how can caretaking behavior, genetically encoded into physiological systems in the human form, emerge in evolution when it has such obvious costs? You're giving stuff away, you can be exploited and like. Evolutionists think about 3 principles to understand how this stuff gives rise. First of all, there should be mechanisms that change the calculus of sharing and giving, as Lynne talked about, right? You should take joy in the recipient's gains. You should minimize the costs of giving. Secondly, caretaking behavior, compassion, altruism will spread in human groups if it's contagious. And Lynne talked about very nicely the idea of how contagious a lot of emotions are, and we should really be able to spread goodness to give rise to the biological system's stability in human forms. Finally, we should be able to know who's somebody to engage in a compassionate, cooperative, altruistic relationship with, and who to avoid. All right, so in my remaining 6 minutes, let me tell you some studies a few studies that speak to these ideas. So, a lot of new data coming out, very fascinating, on how the mind and the body are wired to change the costs of giving to others. There are neural imaging studies out of Emory in the past 3 or 4 years. When I give to a stranger, it activates the reward circuits in the brain, the caudate, the nucleus accumbens, and the like, to the same extent as if I receive the same amount of money I give to that person. We feel pleasure in giving. I've done some research, and one of the mechanisms by which we should facilitate altruism and compassion is by increasing our sense of similarity to other people, right? That unleashes giving and altruism. The ethicist Peter Singer said, he's been writing a lot about the circle of compassion, and he said, this is one of the defining ethical insights in human evolution, that I share common stuff with other sentient beings. Not just kin, but other humans around us. And so, based on that idea, sense of similarity minimizes the cost of giving. We did a study of compassion, compared it to another interesting emotion, pride. We showed slides of harm. Kind of probably make you feel the same as when you saw that little monkey that was mortally wounded. You can feel it in your chest, and I'll talk about that. And this was a Berkeley sample, so we made them feel pride. These are Berkeley undergrads. Familiar sights to all of us. That one gets them up singing the fight song. They feel strong and interesting. Here's how similar, just seeing those slides that make you feel compassion, you feel similar, fundamental common humanity with all kinds of different groups, including Stanford undergrads, which still boggles my mind. Is compassion blind? No, it's not. You can see what this is a graph saying how much similarity do you feel to 20 different groups. We scored the vulnerability of the group and the need for care. And what you find, as you see with compassion, you have the increased sense of similarity to more and more vulnerable groups. Compassion is oriented toward shifting your sense of similarity to those in need to facilitate the kind of altruistic behavior we talked about. Now, I'm going to talk very briefly in my last 4 or 5 minutes about a region of the nervous system, absolutely stunning. It's called the vagus nerve. It is thought to be unique to mammals. Not sure if I have a picture of it. I'll probably have a picture of it later. It starts at the top of your spinal cord, winds through your body. It slows your heart rate down. It helps you vocalize. It helps you move your facial muscles. It's loaded up with oxytocin receptors, which look like they enable trust and devotion and sacrifice to others. The vagus nerve, it is thought, is unique to mammals, and people are making the case that we developed it to support caretaking behavior. And lo and behold, in the study I just showed you, when you see those compassion slides, 2 minutes, it triggers increased vagus nerve activity. And then the vagus nerve, or RSA, another way of calling it, correlates with my feeling of compassion, with less pride, and with the ethical judgment that I'm similar to other people. That's pretty amazing. In your abdomen and through your chest, you have this bundle of nerves that's tracking your sense that you're similar to others and that you're willing to help and exchange. Okay, let me just do one final piece of data, and then for the sake of time, I'll wrap it up. Is compassion contagious? Is altruism and kindness and just a feeling of goodwill or trust in others contagious? There are, as Lynne was talking about, we have amazing capacities thanks to these mirror neurons and the frontal lobes in particular, the orbital frontal cortex in the brain, to really understand others' mental states. It's a dramatic shift in primate evolution. And there are all these amazing studies coming out showing that we're wired up, the body is wired up to take care of others in need. Neonates will cry if they hear another neonate's distress vocalization. They don't cry if they hear their own. It's amazing. There are great studies showing that people's emotions just start to converge when you put them in the same room together. I've studied this. We did this study. We studied Berkeley roommates, randomly selected individuals. They're plopped into a room together, and lo and behold, like Ingmar Bergman's persona, their emotions start to become like each other over the course of the year. We're wired up to converge in our emotions. Barbara Ehrenreich has recently written about collective joys and how contagious goodwill is. But what I'd like to conclude on is something that a first insight that emerged as a kind of a behavioral system out of which our loftier feelings of sympathy and compassion would emerge, which is touch. And the insight really came out of the non-human primate literature initially. I've shown you this weird picture that looks a little like SpongeBob, but it's actually, and I apologize for it, it's kind of had an odd effect. But Nina Jablonski, California Academy of Sciences, has done this amazing new book on the skin. And the human skin is astonishing. We've got dozens of cells underneath the skin that do many different important functions for us. One is the immune system has one of your first lines of defense against pathogens is that inflammation response, and I'll talk about it at the very end. And we have several different cells that are responsive to different kinds of touch. So our thinking was one of the ways in which you can spread compassion is through positive tactile contact, touch. And we've learned from the non-human literature, I'm going to give you two final findings. Touch is, by the way, in the United States, we live in an astonishingly touch-deprived culture, I hate to tell you. You can video record Americans sitting in line at McDonald's. They touch each other twice. No, the Brits touch each other twice. Americans, 0. Brazilians, 128 times as they wait for their Big Mac. You know, they're just constantly touching each other. Now, new neuroscience of touch. It activates the reward circuits in your brain, just a soft touch of the forearm. It builds up reciprocity and food sharing in non-human primates. Lynne showed that. It signals safety. Teachers patting up students on their backs, those students are twice as likely to speak out in class. And then my colleague, Darlene Francis, has found rat dams, rat mothers that frequently touch their pups by covering their bodies and then by licking and grooming the mouth. It's about 10 to 15% of their waking hours. Those rat pups that are touched a lot, controlling for the right kind of stuff, a year later have less interneural connections in the fear circuitry of the brain and have stronger immune systems. Remarkable new data on the virtues of touch. So we asked, can you communicate compassion through touch? Right? I built a big barrier in my lab. People came into the lab. They had to stick their arm through. Another person was given 12 emotions to try to communicate: anger, fear, sadness, compassion, gratitude, love. 1 second touch to the forearm. That person with the arm sticking through has to guess, right? Totally impoverished circumstance, and yet you find that we can make distinctions and pick up and judge compassion, gratitude, and love with 1 second touches to the forearm with 50 to 60% accuracy. Chance guessing, 1 out of 12, 8.5%, wildly accurate. And we also know now touch reduces the vagus nerve and releases oxytocin. So let me conclude with something. Which one? That one? Okay, sorry. That was a little startling to whip through those slides. I wanted to just conclude with, because it's one thing to talk about compassion, but I want to just tell you about a recent study, and I'll end here, of Richie Davidson, a neuroscientist, working in collaboration with Tibetan Buddhists, in part thanks to the Dalai Lama. He's been very interested in science. Richie finds that more pro-social emotional states tend to be preferentially activated in the left hemisphere of the brain. It's a very simple finding. You obviously would want more specificity. But if I see images of people that I care for, that side of the brain is activated. He then first studied a Tibetan Buddhist monk, Natu Ricard. He had him to sit in the room and rest. You look at a normal distribution of where our brains are activated. About half of us are on the right side of that distribution, half are on the left, right? Then there's a data point that's 6 standard deviations out here. Guess who that is? It's not your grandmother. It's the monk. And through all this cultivation and discipline, training the mind toward compassion, he had this activation. And then they've done, of course, monks lead different lives. They may be different kinds of people than you or I. And so Richie and John Kabat-Zinn have done a study taking software engineers, training them in the techniques of mindfulness meditation, extending that circle of compassion, becoming super kind is the focus of the meditation. Several weeks later, their brain activation moves to the left, and they have enhanced immune function. Pretty neat data showing we can cultivate this stuff. So that's the evolutionary story for humans, where we have plastic minds we can cultivate, and that's all I have to say. Okay.
The next section of the presentation, our two speakers will talk between themselves and perhaps raise some questions that you all would like answered later on in the question-answer session. Thank you.
Who wants to? You know what? The last bit, I want to mention just an observation from what I remember about neural processes and things. The right hemisphere is often lights up more under fearful conditions.
Right.
The right hemisphere. So it's like almost an opposite effect. Fear versus compassion.
Right.
What part of the brain do you do it in?
Right. Actually, and that is a nice summary of the literature on hemispheric asymmetry. We like to, I know out in popular culture, we have the right-brainers and the left-brainers, and you are all probably more left-brainers, and you're married to a right-brainer, and we think they're analytic versus the like. But I think the fairer summary of that literature is that the right brain seems to be wired up to pick up threat and danger and negative stuff preferentially, and then the left hemisphere is really involved with approach-related behavior and intentional behavior and goal-directed behavior. And in the literature on compassion, there's this really important distinction that probably maps onto what you're talking about, which is there's a subset of people when they see harm who feel compassion. There's another subset who feel distress and agitated, and they're less likely to have altruistic tendencies. And that probably does map onto this interesting threat versus care separation in the brain. So that'll be, but we don't know, and that'll be important for future research.
Yeah. Well, I have a couple more questions.
Okay.
I actually wrote them down.
Okay.
So if it's true that natural selection has favored compassion, if it's true, and that we have these neural structures for compassion, then why are we so often lacking in it?
Yeah.
Why are we so downright mean?
Yeah.
So often.
That's the. I mean, I take the when I read the neuroscience literature and look at all the amazing progress in understanding how emotions like anger and fear on the mean side, or disgust or contempt, versus these more pro-social emotions that we just got a glimpse of today, of gratitude and love, and we could talk about that, or compassion. The data are suggesting that they're going to all have different neural circuits in the brain, most likely genetically encoded, and therefore shaped by some kind of evolutionary process. And that suggests very intuitively that we're wired up, as Walt Whitman said, he wasn't a neuroscientist, but he had good things to say, that, we're many things. And I think the questions that we should be asking to a certain extent are, how to create cultural conditions that potentiate these more pro-social tendencies. You emphasize teaching, paying teachers better, or whatever it may be. But I think that would be an interesting place to find variation, is in the cultural conditions.
I've lost my train of thought. Oh well. If these Tibetan monks are so, if it takes so much training,
yeah,
to become a highly compassionate person, I mean, that kind of argues against
Yeah.
this ability.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, it's, I mean, when I've been lucky to spend a few days with these Tibetan monks as part of these, Tibetan Buddhism science panels, and they do lead extraordinary lives, and the discipline with which they try to cultivate compassion, I haven't worked that hard on anything in my life, except maybe my kids, certainly not my dissertation, for God's sake. And if you read the content of the meditative practices, they have dozens of exercises about extending compassion, becoming super kind, retraining the mind. But that's why, I have a couple of responses to that, which is, one, we know from psychological science that, just how you approach a person, the mindset you have, the set of expectations you develop, wields enormous influence on your well-being and your neuroscience and the like. So clearly, just bringing in that value of compassion is important. I think, secondly, that's why that software engineer study is really exciting from my standpoint. They took people like us, right, who, when you're getting out in that circle of compassion exercise, you have to be compassionate in this meditation first to yourself, and you go, okay, I can do that. Then to someone you love, okay, I got my kids, I'm doing well. Then you go to somebody you kind of feel you're having a little bit of trouble with. Ooh, that's tough territory. And you back up. But they show, those software engineers, with a little bit of discipline, 20 minutes a day, shifting brain activation and enhanced immune function. So that's really promising. And now Phil Shaver, one of your colleagues out at UC Davis, is showing, just by priming people to think about more caretaking thoughts will shift different measures of compassion. So I take heart in the plasticity of the brain and the power of the right kind of stimuli.
So when they do the MRIs or whatever, is it the neocortex that's
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah.
So in a sense, what they're doing is they're sort of stopping and thinking about how they want to act, how they
Right.
want to behave. So
Right.
it's a real cognitive kind of process.
It is.
So really, I mean, we've got these huge neocortices. Shouldn't we all just be able to do that? And we all have a big brain. We all have
Yeah.
that. Why does it take training to make these choices? Why can't we just in any moment say, okay, now how am I going to act right now at this moment? How
Right.
am I going to act? Do I become angry because he cut me off in traffic, or do I just let it go, or what? How am I going to act? Why don't we stop and think
Right.
so often?
Right. It's a great question. So, and there's a hypothesis in the psychological literature, and it drives me nuts, but I think they're right, which is the bad in the human nervous system is stronger than the good, right? And there are a lot of data that support that rather cynical hypothesis. One of my favorites is by Paul Rosen, a very creative guy. It'd be fun to bring out for these sessions. He observes that the contagious power of bad stuff is more powerful than the contagious power of good stuff, right? So if you're about to have your favorite meal and a cockroach walks by, your whole meal's ruined, right? Now think about the opposite idea of a good thing contaminating bad stuff. You're about to eat a pile of cockroaches, and then you put a truffle next to it. The cockroaches don't become truffle-like, right? So bad stuff is more strong than good stuff, which kind of makes you start to raise questions, as you've raised, that, well, maybe we have to work a little harder to train the mind to be good. Maybe the bad stuff, the sense of threat or aggression or I don't want to call self-preservation bad, is more deeply rooted in the nervous system, and therefore more readily accessible. And I think that's a fair hypothesis, that we got to work harder on the good stuff. I will note, it's very interesting, couple of things. The regions of the brain that are involved in compassion, our preliminary science suggests, are more plastic and more subject to shifts given environmental input than the regions involved in threat detection, like the amygdala. The amygdala is very deep, old, and is less malleable than these frontal lobe regions that Lynne was referring to. Second thing that's interesting is there's a little bit of data suggesting the heritability of the hostility in humans is stronger than the heritability of prosociality, right? So the prosocial side is probably more in need of cultivation and training and a lot of environmental shaping.
Yeah, because I think when you think about a newborn, okay, there's no way that they can be compassionate. You know, they're just not there yet.
I don't know.
Well, that's good. That's interesting.
So I told you the study. They cry with distress at another newborn's distress.
That's true. Well, so I should say super kind, because they can't act on it. They can be they can have empathy.
Yeah, but they can't feed themselves, but they're hungry.
But they're totally, what I see at that stage is that they're pretty selfish. They have to be in order to survive. And so they're taking as much as they can get from whoever wants to give it to them. And maybe that, because it starts out that way, that they really need to have that self-interest in mind to begin with. That gets the ball rolling faster on the negative sorts of things.
That's right.
And then it's later that I've got a 13-year-old boy right now, son, and I realize
that'll shift you toward a cynical view of human nature as fast as anything. That's right.
What I'm learning is that this is a really crucial time for socialization, for learning how to live with other people. It's a real challenge for boys.
I agree, and it's one of the risks of a Western ideology is, if we think it's all just emotion and sort of genetically based stuff and not discipline and cultivation, then we run the risk of not cultivating those teenagers toward more pro-social ends.
Yeah.
Well, I think that your teenage son points to a question that I have for you.
Okay.
And this may help you in your parenting causes. So there's a hypothesis. So when you survey the literature, it's just an interesting new period of evolutionist scholarship in humans, as humans like Lynne's reference to Elliot Sober, philosopher of biology, are grappling with just how widely abundant compassion is and caretaking behavior is and how pro-social we are. Where in the world does this come from, right? And I've made the case probably the primary source is caretaking of these vulnerable offspring. But there's an interesting idea that has a little bit of data to it, and it may help you with your son. But I have my question is not about your son, it's about other dangerous primates, the primates you've been studying.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is this, which is, there's a hypothesis that another way that compassion and altruism got built into the human nervous system is through sexual selection. And the idea is, one of the ways that traits get built into the human nervous system, not only can they help you survive, not only can they help your offspring make it to the next generation, but just as importantly, Darwin argued, do those traits help you win mates and other reproductive opportunities? Well, guess what the number one trait is around the world in picking a mate? Guess. Kindness. It trumps them all. There's a big controversy around this that, well, men like beautiful women and women like wealthy men. Don't tell your son that. Otherwise, he won't go into teaching or academics. But and that generated the big controversy. But at the top of the list is kindness and compassion, right?
Yeah.
So, is that true in other primates?
I think if you took different species, you might get different answers.
Right.
In baboons, I mentioned the fellow who's called a friend. Yeah. He's kind. He would be what we would call kind to his lady friend. Whether he gets matings out of that, we don't know for sure.
I never did. But, all those women I was friends with, I was waiting for the high-paying paycheck, but that didn't come.
But some females will just mate with the male who beats everybody else up and is the only one around who kicks them out. So,
but see, and at the bottom of my list of what is different about human evolution is our mating patterns. Obviously, are radically different, right? in the primates bonobo, as far as I understand, males don't know who their offspring are. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So that suggests we do, and there's more caretaking in human males, it then becomes a dimension to attracting mates, as data.
Yeah. But I'm puzzled. I'm questioning sexual selection as the link here, because if it's equally desirable in both males and females, then maybe it's, sexual selection tends to explain differences between males and females. Males being bigger or more aggressive, and females being more nurturing or whatever to their offspring.
Right.
So if both males and females are kind, or the desire is to find a mate that's kind, maybe it's not sexual selection per se.
Right.
Maybe it's
illusion.
Something else. Something, I don't know. I'd have to think a little bit more about it. But there are cases of other species of primates, the tamarins and marmosets, where females have twins up to twice a year, and she hands them over to the male, one of the males in the group, and he carries them around. He carries them most of the time. The female just nurses them. And it's been suggested that he needs to do that in order for those infants to survive.
Right.
What's interesting is that he may or may not be the father, because you can have multiple males in the group and they can all mate with the female, and so any one of them could be a father, or they could share parentage.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
So I have a follow-up question. I don't know how we're doing on one more. Okay. One of the fascinating questions that we have no answer to in the human literature is what you referred to in one of your bullet points, which is the ecological, that is, the environmental conditions that give rise to altruism, right? And we know when you study the anthropological literature in humans, there's radical variation in how compassionate people are, how kind they are. You can go to the Ifuluk in Micronesia, and their central emotion is compassion, and it just organizes, Kathy Lutz argued, their social existence. Turnbull's famous observations of the Ik, I think it was, they literally were a culture that became devoid of compassion and would laugh if a child burnt his or her hand in a fire or something, and absolutely devoid. And so it raises probably one of the deepest questions in this literature is, and I would love your thoughts in the non-human primate world, which is, what are the environmental conditions, resource fecundity, climate, whatever the case may be, that amplify the need for altruism or de-amplify it? How would you think about that?
Well, the biggie is whether you've got kin around or not.
Right.
Yeah, you have. It's in non-human primates and other animals. If your kin are around you, you're more likely to act altruistically.
Just turn the system on her.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. And in most primates, in the old world, and we are old world primates, females tend to live and die in the group that they were born in, and so they're surrounded by their mothers, their sisters, their aunts, and what you find is a lot of cooperative interactions within the groups of these females.
Right.
It's not necessarily the same in the New World primates, because females disperse, and so a lot of females disperse. So what you end up getting is fewer reports, fewer observations of that kind of altruistic behavior in those primates.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Good answer.
So I hope during the last hour you've been thinking of questions that you might want to ask. You can direct them at either one of the speakers or make them general questions. I would ask you to keep your questions moderately brief so many people can get their questions asked. Sir.
So there was the discussion about genetic relatedness and how that relates to kindness, and you're talking about having kin around. There's also been this idea with evolution. If you compare people with other people, we have so much in common genetically, and even with other animals like other primates, etc. It almost seems like there should be more kindness there because we're so similar.
Yeah.
But then when you talk about competition, and one thing I think about, it seems to me a striking example of this is like on a farm. We're omnivores, most of us are anyway. Sometimes we eat plants, sometimes we eat animals. And if you take a situation, say on a farm, you've got a chicken and you've got to cut that chicken's head off because you're going to eat it. There's got to be some kind of a training there, where, children don't normally feel good about that. It's a conflictual situation, and yet they need to go there in some cases. So I see this tension, and maybe it's that tension between the competition and yet the genetic comparison that would relate to altruism that leaves us where we are. So.
Yeah, I agree, and I like your analysis a lot. And regrettably, I have a colleague at Berkeley, Kai-Ping Pong, who studies differences in Western European and East Asian scientific thinking. And it's much easier for East Asian scientists to assume that there are contradictions and tensions and contradictory states in any kind of system they study. And it's harder for Western Europeans. We like linear, singular truths. And when you read the literature on the altruism debate, that is often characteristic of the conclusions people draw, which is, no, there's pure altruism and that's it, or it doesn't exist. And I think you're right. I think, the brain and our nervous systems have profound competitive tendencies that can turn on at a flip of a switch, and very powerful vagus nerve-based frontal lobe cooperative tendencies. So I think you're right, and absolutely.
This is opportunity that we have because of our big brains to make these choices, to actually decide what we want to do in any given situation, and we can teach ourselves to cut the chicken's head off if we have to, or not. So we can teach ourselves to become vegetarians or not. So we have a lot of choice, and I think we don't realize that we have these choices available to us. I guess that gets into the question of free will, and that's a different topic. Maybe next time, I don't know. But I think we're not. When they say that we don't use anything but 10% of our brain, well, I don't know where anybody comes up with that number. But what I'm thinking is, well, there might be some point to that. We don't take the opportunity to make choices based on thinking, based on thought. How are we going to react in any given situation? We just react. We just do it without thinking first. So I think that if we can start to think and really question what we want to do every second of the day, maybe that's the training that the monks go through, is to be able to say, okay, now what am I going to do? And now what am I going to do? And do it step by step. And after a while, it's got to be tiring. It's got to be tiring after a while. But I think maybe that's what it takes for us to be able to respond one way or the other. It has to be a thoughtful way. Otherwise, we're not taking advantage of what we've got in terms of our neural structures.
I have a question. I kind of get the idea that you do have to use your will and understanding when to kill in order to be able to survive, to support your survival instincts. But my question now has something to do with, are psychopaths born, or are they made low-grade, subjected to brutality, low-grade brutality that they have to deal with constantly? Do the parts of their brain die that make them really become psychopathic, or does a big traumatic event kind of change their brain and they become just psychopathic?
So both are true, and there is much as Lynne talked about, we study the extremes of the human distribution, the variations on this, the themes of human nature. And we study the extremes to learn about functions of particular systems. So Asperger's kids are really, good language functioning and memory and reasoning and the like, have very complex deficits in the realm of empathy, as one example that Lynne talked about. With respect to sociopaths and really violent individuals, one thing we know is and the biggest predictor is violent homes. So if you're beaten, you become violent, although most kids who are beaten do not. There are recent studies, it's very interesting, coming out of USC with Adrian Rain's lab, that very violent people have less interconnectivity of the neurons in what's called the orbital frontal cortex, which is a region of the frontal lobes involved in ethical decisions and empathy and compassion. So it looks like whatever root got them there, they take a hit in that region of the brain. So I think the data are speaking to both of your intuitions.
Thank you for your talk, both of you. That question of whether kindness is wired to us or whether we're programmed for it is, well, we obviously are in this situation worldwide, whether our propensity for meanness or aggressiveness, which we certainly have, is it going to be outweighed by our capacity for empathy and kindness? And it's clear now that we're faced with the problem of having empathy with people of much lesser degree of, a higher degree of separation. Your R number you mentioned, I was struck by the R, the degree of, and I seem to remember that somehow the amount of time we've evolved that we're no more than half to the 20th or something like that. There are no more than 20 degrees of separation. If I just pick that number sort of arbitrarily, because that becomes, if you use that number, is about 1/1,000,000th. And trying to see if that has any implication for there are about 5 times 10 to the 9th people. And that sort of implies that, let's just say that your R times your B equals C, that implies that a tenth of our, if we have a cost to ourselves of a tenth of something or other, I'd say a tenth of our income, a tithe, that's equivalent to the same benefit to the whole human population. The numbers work out about that way. It's obviously approximations. But this is just really a comment, is that for some reason we seem to be able to feel aggressiveness. The question of meanness doesn't seem to apply whether there's a different R. We seem to feel more easily aggressiveness to people of distant connection than we do feel empathy to people. It's not the same proportion. And the question is, maybe we can find some way to cultivate and increase the ratio between the benefit that we get to the human population as the whole world to our cost versus the aggressive number. It's a complicated, but the arithmetic is simple. I guess the question is what to do about it. And that's just a comment, and I'm just sort of asking you to say more about what you've already been talking about. That's really what it's.
Well, one thing that strikes me is that we, like these empathy neurons, we can fool ourselves. We're pretty good at fooling ourselves. We have ways that our bodies can do that. And another way that we can fool ourselves into being more compassionate with each other is to spend more time with each other. And just that physical presence helps, because in the wild, if you're looking at other animals, the ones that are nearby are usually the relatives. And those are so natural selection has worked out that there might be a rule that you act nice to those around you, because they're going to be your relatives. They're going to be your relatives. Now for us, because we come and go and that's no longer the case, that doesn't mean we can't fool our genes into thinking that, or thinking in quotes, that those around us are our relatives. And so
the whole world's population.
Yeah, I mean, you could go along that way, but it's probably more likely direct interactions that's going to make the difference. So you often hear about people saying, well, you know, I didn't understand this culture. I didn't understand these people were, you know, my country's fighting against the people of this country. I didn't understand them, and I was angry and I hated them until I got to know them. And then I started to like them, and I saw that they were not that different from me. And just that interaction helps us to fool our genes and make it so that we treat others as if they're our relatives. So that's one way to do it. So, you know, world travel might be a good thing.
Thank you. That's it. Good. Go ahead.
I was just wondering if, using your equation that you gave for kindness, if a honeybee would be considered kind, and the drone that gives up his life for the group.
Yeah, in fact, that was the kind of thing that Darwin had the problem with. He saw these non-reproductives living their lives, and he couldn't figure out how it could evolve. And it ends up that Hamilton figured out that, in fact, they're closely related to the queen. And they can give up their reproductive success by helping her, and by helping her they actually benefit more through inclusive fitness or kin selection. So I guess you would call them kind from our perspective. I don't know that they think of themselves as being kind. That'd be a stretch. But, you know, who knows? We don't know. We just don't know.